sports roof Cobra. Hottest thing on the road with a price to match.
Back in 1968, Ford introduced a higher trim version of the Fairlane and named it the Torino, the Italian city known outside of Italy as Turin. The Torino trim package was so popular that by 1970, Ford made the Torino its own model and would introduce the Gran Torino and high-performance Gran Torino Sport in 1972, just before the oil embargo started shrinking engine output.
The 72 Torino, including the first Gran Torino.
Despite less power and bigger bumpers, the Torino would gain new popularity as a star of the TV series Starsky and Hutch. But thanks to serious reliability issues and corrosion, most of the 2.5 million Torinos ever built are no longer on the road today. This is the story of the Ford Torino and Gran Torino. This is my old car.
Look, I think you better jump. Don't be funny. Look, jump. You've been killed. You jump. I'm driving. You jump. I'll drive. You jump.
If you're a regular viewer of my channel, this particular car may be unexpected, as I normally only feature cars which had at least some of their production in the 1980s through mid-2000s, and the Ford Torino ended production in 1976. So yes, I am stretching the boundaries a bit. But I also included the Torino in my previous episode about cars named after places, and realized the Torino had some interesting history that would make it a good choice for its own episode. The place in question, Torino, is the name of a city in northern Italy that is often called the Detroit of Italy, as several Italian automakers call this city home, although you may recognize the name of the town as Turin, as that is the English spelling. The Torino started out not as its own car, but as a trim designation of the Ford Fairlane, which itself was first released as its own model in 1955.
This two-tone Fairlane town sedan exemplifies the years-ahead styling of these brilliant new cars.
The Fairlane initially was a large car, like pretty much every car was in the late 1950s, but in the case of the Fairlane, it was so large that its overall length allowed Ford to offer a convertible model with a retractable hardtop called the Skyliner from 1957 to 1959.
Have a Twinkie, snap ahead.
However, by 1962, the Fairlane had shrunk to become Ford's intermediate model, with the Galaxy now occupying the top spot. By 1968, with sales of the Fairlane starting to slip, Ford offered an upscale version of the Fairlane to be named Torino. Besides being named for the Italian city, as I noted earlier, this wouldn't be the first time Ford had considered using that name, as it was an early contender for what would eventually become the Ford Mustang. Ford had hoped that the connection between the name Torino and the exotic Italian sports cars built there would help give the Fairlane line a much-needed boost. Between the Fairlane and Torino, Ford offered 14 distinct models. The base Fairlane offered a two-door hardtop, four-door sedan, and a four-door wagon. The upscale Fairlane 500 offered the same, as well as a convertible, and a two-door fastback, which Ford dubbed the sports roof.
Hey, the Torino has a new 428 mil. I hear the power anchors are caliper discs.
Then there was the even more upscale Torino, including the wagon now decked out with simulated wood grain on the sides. Each of the two-door Torinos could be upgraded yet again to the Torino GT.
Looks like a groovy California rake job.
Although all Fairlanes and non-GT Torinos came standard with a 3.3-liter inline six-cylinder engine, the Torino GT could be had with a 428 cubic inch 7-liter V8, commonly known as the Cobra Jet. Although officially rated at 335 horsepower, many believed at the time that the true horsepower rating was far higher. Both Car and Driver and Motor Trend magazines tested it and gave it rave reviews, especially considering the Cobra Jet option only cost $306, and a Torino GT convertible was selected as a pace car for the Indy 500 in 1968. Thanks to the sports roof design, Ford also offered the Torino GT for NASCAR. Its aerodynamic styling proved to be much more than just looking sporty. With additional wind-cheating features, such as a unique front end and lowered suspension, it was called the Torino Talladega. Although NASCAR's homologation rules required a minimum of 500 Talladegas to be produced for public sale, Ford managed to sell 743 of them for 1968. Their success on the racetrack is the primary reason why Dodge and Plymouth responded with their radical Dodge Charger Daytona and Plymouth Superbird models for 1969 and 1970. The Torino won back-to-back Grand National Series titles, and that success, along with similar success from the Chrysler models, led to NASCAR banning all of them from future races. Ford would later start development of a new NASCAR model for 1970, called the Torino King Cobra, but thanks to homologation rules now requiring up to 3,000 built for public sale, then Ford President Lee Iacocca shut the project down, leaving only 3 prototypes ever built. And of course, if you know Ford history, most Ford models had a Mercury counterpart. For the Torino, that would be the Mercury Montego, another model I included in my Cars Named After Places episode, in this case, Montego Bay, Jamaica. Just like the Torino was an upscale Ford Fairlane, the Montego was an upscale Mercury Comet. Whereas the Torino GT name was used for the highest performance models, the equivalent Mercury was a Cyclone, which had been a Comet trim designation prior to 1968. For 1969, the Cyclone also had a Cobra Jet model as a twin to the Torino Cobra Jet, as well as a NASCAR model using the same 7-liter V8 as the Torino. However, the Mercury version wasn't nearly as popular as the Ford, resulting in the Mercury Cobra Jet, or CJ as it was sometimes called, to be dropped for 1970.
Lincoln Mercury. Better idea cars from the makers of Lincoln Continental.
The Torino's success in NASCAR helped fuel demand for the street version of the car, so much so that Ford made the unusual move for the 1970 model year of switching the Torino and Fairlane names, such that Torino was now the name of the car, and Fairlane was the trim name for entry-level Torinos. However, the Fairlane name wouldn't last long, as by halfway through the 1970 model year, Ford changed the entry-level Torinos to be Ford Falcons, the same name once used on its own compact model, but was forced to drop starting on January 1st of 1970, thanks to new safety standards that the compact Falcon couldn't meet. The Mercury Montego also took over from the Comet, although unlike the Ford, the Comet name was eliminated entirely and not kept on as a trim level. 1970 also introduced new Coke bottle styling, but the distinctive raked roofline option continued from the previous year, still called the Sports Roof. This was the only body style available for the high-performance Torino Cobra, but the same roof was an option on non-Cobra two-door Torinos. Oddly enough, the Torino Cobra was considered a lower-level trim than the Torino GT, as Ford didn't want the Torino to only be known as a muscle car. This is why, for 1970, you could also get the Torino Brougham, which unlike other Torinos with exposed headlamps, the Brougham had hidden headlamps, as well as a more luxury-themed trim inside and out. And you could still get a Torino wagon, the top version being the Torino Squire. All Torino wagons offered a two-way tailgate, which Ford called their magic doorgate, but wagon staples such as a third-row rear-facing seat and a roof rack were optional. If you lived in the U.S. Midwest back in 1970, you may recall that Ford also offered a very exclusive version of the Torino Cobra, called the Torino Twister Special.
It's a twister! It's a twister!
It had 10 additional horses, with an upgraded 4-barrel carburetor, and lacking power brakes or power steering, making it more at home on the drag strip than on the street. Only a few Midwest dealers sold it, complete with unique twister badging, and only 90 were ever produced. Less than 30 are known to still exist today, making the Twister Special one of the rarest muscle cars ever produced. There were a few changes for 1971, other than now both the Fairlane and Falcon names were gone as trim levels, and the hideaway headlamps had expanded beyond the Brougham and Squire, for its further attempt to move the Torino more towards the luxury class. Although you could now get a hood scoop on the Torino GT, not just the Torino Cobra, although the hood scoop was non-functional on the GT. Sales for 1971 were over 326,000, which would be considered huge for most any car model. However, that was a drop from over 407,000 just a year earlier.
And you can take your choice of sedans, wagons, sports roofs, hardtops, even a convertible.
1972 could be considered the start of the second or third generation, depending on if you count the Torino's time as a trim of the Ford Fairlane as the first gen. Most notable for this generation was the addition of the Gran Torino and Gran Torino Sport trims, which took over the original mid-level Torino 500 and the top-end Torino GT and Cobra. The Gran Torino could be had with the sports roof, had its own unique egg crate front grille as compared to the base Torino, and for 1972 only, an unobtrusive front and rear bumper that was contoured to more cleanly line up with the body lines. This would change for 1973, as new federal mandates meant much larger 5-mile-an-hour bumpers in the front, and a year later, they would also be required in the rear. This generation of the Torino line also changed from unibody to body-on-frame, which was atypical for most cars of the era, as a more common evolution during the 70s, and especially the 80s, was switching from body-on-frame to unibody. The change was made as part of Ford's attempt to move the Torino more towards a luxury model, since body-on-frame made for a more isolated and therefore more floaty ride. Ford also diverted from the previous gen by having the two-door models having a 4-inch shorter wheelbase than the four-door models. Because of the smaller front bumpers on the 72 model as compared to the 73, the 72 Gran Torino is often considered one of the most popular to collectors today.
A Ford Torino, huh? Pretty fancy. Can I try it?
Sure. Give it the acid test, Kathy. You don't have to baby Torino.
Although the 1972 Gran Torino Sport is not faster than older Torinos, as restrictions made to improve emissions lowered horsepower. But those restrictions would only get worse over the following years, and the bigger bumpers beginning in '73 certainly didn't help the car's aerodynamics.
What do you think, Kathy?
Pretty good, Dad, for a car.
For this reason, or maybe because '72 was the best-selling year for all Torinos, at nearly 500,000 sold for that model year, a '72 model starred in the 2008 movie Gran Torino.
Grandpa, when did you get the vintage car?
Starring Clint Eastwood.
1972.
I won't provide any spoilers, other than to say that the '72 Gran Torino itself has little screen time, despite the movie's title. You should especially watch it if you're a Michigan native as myself, as all the filming was done in the Metro Detroit area.
You like him, don't you?
Are you kidding? He tried to steal my car.
For 1973, the Gran Torino Sport became less sporty, with the hood scoop removed and no ram air induction as the prior model year had. There was also the addition of the Gran Torino Brome, which added luxury features such as vinyl seats that were intended to mimic leather. And as noted before, the '73 had larger federally mandated front bumpers. The transition to more luxury themes is clearly what the public wanted, as Ford still sold nearly 500,000 for the 1973 model year.
Incredibly smooth riding. Stable, strong, and quiet.
By 1974, the sports roof option was gone, and a new trim called the Gran Torino Elite was available.
America's youngest luxury car. Ford Gran Torino Elite.
Meant to compete with the Chevy Monte Carlo, which, like the Gran Torino, was putting more emphasis on luxury instead of performance. Although sales for 1974 dropped to around 420,000, it was still a very popular car, and so was the Elite, which accounted for nearly 100,000 of those sales. Despite Ford de-emphasizing the sporty options of the Gran Torino, it was given one more chance in 1975, with the debut of a new buddy cop show called Starsky and Hutch. The producers of the show wanted to have a sporty-looking car for the title characters to drive, and since Ford was supplying the cars for the show, they chose a two-door Gran Torino. However, the Gran Torino's standard paint scheme wasn't exactly flashy, so they painted it a bright red with a big white stripe wrapping around the side windows, a look that would later be dubbed by one of the show's stars, Paul Michael Glaser, as the striped tomato.
I hated the car. It was absolutely ludicrous that a detective would be carrying it, driving around in what I called a striped tomato.
And the writers liked it so much they had co-star David Soul use the same name in a Starsky and Hutch episode.
You just want me to drive around in a striped tomato like you got. My car's a striped what?
The striped tomato quickly became popular with fans of the show, so much so that in 1976, Ford offered 1,000 replica Gran Torinos. Since the bright red paint was no longer an option for 1976, Ford would start with a white car and then mask the stripe before painting the rest of the car red.
Okay, now what? Okay, we're gonna take this car and land it on that boat.
And of course, to no one's surprise, the stripe has made its way onto other cars as well. Despite the popularity of Starsky and Hutch, which lasted until 1979, the Torino's last year was 1976. The Elite trim had split to become its own model in 1975, leaving under 200,000 Torinos sold that year, and about the same for 1976. Although those sales numbers were still impressive, it marked a significant drop from its peak just a couple years earlier. The Torino's official replacement for 1977 was the LTD2, essentially the same car as the former Torino, Gran Torino, and Elite, and continued Ford's transition of their intermediate cars into the luxury space and away from performance.
When America needs a better idea, Ford puts it on wheels.
Finding a Torino still intact today is a tough job. No thanks to the most common killer of 70s cars, rust. But the Torino was also notorious for poor reliability, and the car-buying public simply moved on.
Oh, Jesus, what's that smell, man?
Had it not become a staple of 70s pop culture, it may have remained completely forgotten today. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, click the like button and subscribe to my channel. If you want to own a car from the 70s to mid-2000s that you rarely see today and would like it featured in a future episode, leave a reply in the comments or contact me at the email shown here. See you next time.